Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this presentation. In this essay I'd like to talk about the Russian or Soviet battle tank from World War II, the T34. Now there have been a few articles I've seen recently that have really, some have suggested it was a heap of shit, others have suggested it was the most advanced, technically the most advanced tank of the war, and really won the war for the Red Army, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions and misperceptions about the T34 in the real world rather than in sort of starry-eyed theory. So that's what I'd like to talk about, tank warfare, but particularly the T34. Now, tanks were just something fairly new in 1917, 1918, and to some extent proved decisive in certain parts of the Western Front where the British were using them. In spite of being the innovators in tank warfare, the British dropped it after World War One and didn't really do much with it, and didn't really develop a tank doctrine and use of tanks, how to use tanks to win wars, win battles, and how to achieve decisive battle victories where the tank would play a prominent role. Now, it wasn't that there weren't people that were having had considered it. Senior officers such as Hobart and a Little Hart and a couple of others were prominent in sort of talking about tank warfare. They couldn't get anyone interested in the more senior generals and the general staff, the planners and the strategists, and of course the politicians that had to sign off on the budget. So really nothing was done. In France it was much the same thing. They were probably a little bit further in front there, but not by a huge amount. There was still, some of their tanks were quite good, but the French, but they hadn't developed a doctrine. But there were officers, usually at the level of colonel or junior generals, brigadier generals, that were really pushing for something to be done with armoured, as they called it, the tanks. They called them the armoured warfare. The heavily armoured car with a cannon on it, which was a tank. So now the Russians and the Soviets, the Red Army, had been pretty much the same as well. They really hadn't developed a doctrine. They had developed a doctrine of sorts, but not using it as a decisive piece of battlefield kit. The Soviets and even the Russians before them had this idea or this concept or doctrine of warfare where they would have a material advantage with men or equipment or both, and they would advance along a broad front rather than try and make a decisive strike somewhere. They would advance along a broad front. This would naturally put pressure on the enemy's position. It would then draw in all their reserves and all their backups and all that sort of thing would all be drawn in because of the advancing along such a broad front. And then somewhere the front would crack. And because all the resources were committed, then the place where it cracked, with the Soviet Red Army forces would kind of keep on going and try and exploit the breakthrough. But this broad front, putting broad pressure across a broad, 100 kilometres wide or something like that, even wider, was really the doctrine. Now, as a consequence, they perceived the tank as something that would advance maybe slightly ahead of the infantry, but really would be, it was a heavy infantry support vehicle, portable artillery, as it were, that had, and some of the cannons on the Soviet Red Army tanks, the T34, the KV-1 and so on, they had quite heavy cannons on them, quite capable of taking out enemy tanks, and also depending on the explosive type of shell they would use, and also assaulting concrete bunkers and things like that. So as the tank was going to advance frontally, the designers of the tank thought, we've got to make a tank that can take frontal hits, because that is going to be advancing with the infantry. Anti-tank guns are going to be firing at it, so we need a tank that can take frontal hits. So they they developed sloping armour. Sloping armour wasn't revolutionary, by the way, but they put sloping armour, and quite heavily armoured, on the front of the tank, so it could take hits as it was moving, because it's moving slowly, so it can easily be hit. So they designed it around that. They also, because it was going to operate in winter conditions, and also the roads in the Soviet Union were very poor, so the tanks had to operate in areas where there were no roads and no hard surfaces. So they developed an extra wide track for the tank, so it could go through snow and mud and an intensive rainy season and so on. So the design was very much local and very much for the circumstances in which they thought they would use it. Now, it had a decent top speed, but the quality of build was so bad that in summer they were lucky to even get half of the top speed, and even then for a short while. And even in the winter, the thing would overheat and they'd have to stop and cool it down. They had a different sort of lubricant type that we used. They wouldn't freeze in winter, or wouldn't freeze as easily as the various oils and fluids and pneumatics would on other tanks, the German tanks, for example. But the Soviets had this T34, and it was on a relative basis quite a heavy tank. It wasn't meant to be achieving decisive, fast breakthroughs. Now, the Wehrmacht, or the German army, did develop a tank doctrine, and Hitler was probably the only leader of an advanced, technically advanced nation that actually spotted the advantage. So Hitler hadn't been chancellor for very long, and some of the more junior generals came to him and said, "Hey, we can use tanks to achieve decisive battlefield victories and breakthroughs. So we can sort of hit one small section of the enemy's front hard, get a decisive breakthrough, then we can come around the back, cut off their communications, cut off their supplies, and create sort of havoc in the rear areas, and achieve battlefield victories from that for relatively minor cost, just by precision strikes using tanks." So the idea is the tanks would be moving quickly. They'd be moving at 10 to 20 kilometres an hour, which in battlefield terms is lightning fast. 10 to 20 kilometres an hour, and before you know it, the enemy doesn't even know where they are. We're surrounded. Are we surrounded? Instructions and orders can't come through because the communications are cut off. Extra supplies such as ammunition and oil and whatever else, gasoline, so they can't get through because the major roads have been cut by these tank columns. And so this idea of an armoured doctrine and using tanks to achieve decisive breakthroughs, this was very much something that only the Germans developed, which gave them a very decisive advantage in the war for quite some time. Even up until the end, they still had, in terms of mobile warfare, they were the battlefield experts on this, and by a long way. So as we can see, with it took the Germans 6 weeks to defeat the French and British armies in 1940 in Europe, a stunning result that nobody had expected, not even Hitler for that matter, and shocked all onlookers. Go, whoa! So what was the difference now? The Germans developed much lighter tanks, and with much lighter guns, cannons on them. So it was still perceived that the tank killing action would still be the anti-tank column. So they would make a unit of tanks complete with anti-tanks, soldier, infantry and trucks and so on, reconnaissance motorcyclists, and create a self-contained unit there that could go out and reduce strong point. Well, not make the decisive breakthrough, and then start shooting up the radio stations, radio towers, capturing ammunition dumps, blocking roads, blowing bridges, or doing all the things we need to create absolute havoc in the rear areas. And the Wehrmacht achieved huge battlefield victories as a result of this doctrine. But the tanks had to be lighter and the guns were lighter. Now the Wehrmacht did think, well, maybe we need to put a heavier cannon on this, and Hitler was one. Well, why don't we get instead of a 37 millimeter medium or lower medium velocity gun, Hitler was saying, well, shouldn't we get a 50 millimeter medium velocity gun so we can take out the heavier enemy tanks? And this was before they knew much about the T34. The heavy Soviet or medium to heavy Soviet tank. This is before they knew about that. But the army complained to Hitler that if we do that, it'll require more ordnance and different size shells and this, that, and the next thing. So Hitler gave us, oh, well, if you don't want it, fine. As it turns out, had the Wehrmacht put all the Panzer 3s and 4s with, particularly the 3s, with 50 millimeter medium velocity cannons, it could have quite possibly changed the outcome of the war, because such a cannon like that could have mortally wounded the T34s. But the 75 millimeter low velocity gun and the 37 millimeter medium velocity cannon on the tanks was just not enough to take out the T34s, because the German gunners were so expert. they could shoot at the tracks of the T34. They were easily taken out, and also they could shoot at the turret ring, which would stuff up the ball bearings so the turret couldn't rotate. So they could do things like that to largely disable the T34s. And because the German gunners were so expert, they were able to knock out or disable a lot of T34s with that. But coming to the T34 itself, the quality of build and manufacture was very poor, and so the breakdown rate was 50% plus. So at any one time, if you had 100 tanks on the battlefield, before there was any enemy action at all, 50 of them would be out of operation due to poor quality workmanship, overheating, things falling apart, the barrels the cannon barrels not being machined to the proper tolerances, the ordnance, the shells. So poorly made, they didn't explode. And the list just went on and on. And if you look at the T34, it's very cramped inside the cabin, so it wasn't easy to keep up a good rate of fire, even for experienced. Now the German tanks had radios in them. The Russians didn't. Only the tank leader had a radio. When it came to outmaneuvering them, the Russians were very slow at assembling in battle formation and organising themselves, and found they were constantly being outmanoeuvred. So the lack of radios and the cramped cabin conditions, because they had to create the cramped cabin conditions to get the slope at the front, to get the higher resistance to armour penetrating shells and other explosives. So overall, the T34 was accidentally successful because it was a heavily armoured front when the German anti-tank units and the tanks had lighter guns. If the German tanks had heavier guns, it wouldn't have been an issue. But if they could get shots at the side and the back, the German gunners, they could get some result there with the 37 millimeter shells, but again, they were rarely enough to knock the tank out completely. So really, the T34 is, I think, by accident formidable. And once the Germans started using heavier guns, it ceased to be formidable to that same extent. What the Russians or the Soviets were able to do is to produce vast numbers of them. Sure, they were low quality builds. Sure, they had a lot of mechanical and other issues, and sure, many of them were out of action and due to breakdowns before they saw the battlefield. But because they were able to produce so many, as the German capacity to produce tanks was declining, then just through sheer volume of machines in the field, they were able to overwhelm the Germans, even though the Wehrmacht and the Panzer groups, even though if you look at the the amount of T34s are knocked out in battle conditions. It was many times what the Germans were able to inflict vastly more damage on the T34 tanks overall, in terms of overall tanks knocked out, than the reverse was the case. So the T34 was it formidable by accident design. There were things like, for example, I mentioned the wider tracks in winter, in the snow and in the rainy season. While the German tanks were lighter, they had narrower tracks. Now, if you did the ratio of, if you like, track surface on the ground relative to weight, the T34 had a decent advantage there. So while the German tanks would get, say, bogged in the mud, for example, also the difference between the bottom of the tank and the height of the track also made the German tanks vulnerable to get stuck in the mud. There was more clearance on the T34 and the wider track, so it was less likely to get caught up in the mud. So in the winter, snowy winter conditions, and in the rainy season conditions, so say from the middle of October through to the end of February or early March, so a 4 to 5 month period each year, the Russian tank designs were superior in the battlefield conditions than the German ones were. Now, the Germans remedied this to a large extent with the Panther and the Tiger tank, increasing the guns and the size of the cannon, and also dealing with the issue of the tracks, the clearance between the tracks and the whole bottom of the tank. But by that stage, it was a little bit too late. There were just too many T34s around, and it took the heavier guns, particularly the 88mm gun, to knock them out. I mean, another sort of side issue here was, because of the number of T34s, the Wehrmacht had to divert a lot of 88mm anti-aircraft guns, which is what they originally designed for. Had to divert a lot of the 88mm anti-aircraft guns to the Eastern Front to battle the heavier Soviet Red Army tanks. And this reduced the ability of the anti-aircraft units to shoot down the American and British bombers that were started to bomb Germany and the industrial areas quite heavily. So that's my take on the T34. I'll be interested to see your comments below. Was it a fantastic tank? No, I think it was an accident of timing and a whole range of other factors. That it wasn't a well-made tank, it was a badly made tank, it was poorly constructed and built. The design was flawed in many ways, but it happened to have heavy armour and a big gun at the time when that was what really counted in tank-to-tank battles. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.